"Come to Reykjavik," the retired ambassador said to me at my grandfather's grave. "Tell them his name. Show them the coin. They'll know what to do." I remember the cold more than anything else. It pressed through my coat like it had a purpose, settling against my collarbone and staying there. The cemetery was small by New England standards, tucked behind a white church in coastal Maine that had stood longer than anyone still living could remember. There were 4 other people at the burial: the priest, 2 men I didn't recognize who stood together at the edge of the tree line and left before the final prayer, and the ambassador. My grandfather had been a Green Beret. 3 tours. Korea, then 2 in Vietnam. He never once mentioned any of it. I grew up calling him Grandpa Walt. He smelled like cedar and machine oil. He kept a garden in the backyard that produced more tomatoes than 2 people could eat, and every Sunday he drove to the same diner in town and ordered the same breakfast and left the same tip. He was not a man who collected attention. He was not a man who invited questions. When he died, he was 81. Peaceful, the doctor said. His heart simply stopped one morning while he was sitting in his chair by the window, a half-finished cup of coffee on the side table beside him. My mother called me at work. I remember the way the office noise continued around me while she spoke, indifferent to what was happening on my end of the phone. He had no children of his own. My mother was his niece. After her parents passed, he raised her quietly and without ceremony, the same way he did everything else. She inherited the house. I inherited a wooden box he'd left specifically for me, labeled in his handwriting with a single word: Claire. I didn't open it at the funeral. I wasn't ready. The ambassador introduced himself after the priest had gone. He was tall, mid-70s, with a posture that said he had once occupied rooms where posture mattered. He didn't offer his title immediately. I only learned it later, after I looked up the name on the card he gave me. He said he'd served alongside my grandfather. Not in the military. After. A different kind of service. He said it carefully, the way people say things they've practiced, not saying too directly. Then he looked at me with steady eyes and said, "Come to Reykjavik. Tell them his name. Show them the coin. They'll know what to do." Before I could speak, he pressed a small business card into my hand and walked toward a black car idling at the cemetery gate. I stood at the grave for a long time after that. My mother hadn't seen the exchange. She was speaking with the priest near the church steps. When she came back, she asked if I was all right. I said yes. I put the card in my coat pocket and didn't mention it. That night, at my grandfather's house, I finally opened the wooden box. Inside was a challenge coin. Heavy, brass, worn smooth on one face from years of handling. On one side, a compass rose with no markings. On the other, a set of coordinates and the outline of a mountain I didn't recognize. Beneath the coin was a folded piece of paper, and beneath that, a passport, not his current one, but an older one, expired. It was thick with entry stamps. Iceland appeared 11 times across a span of 23 years. The most recent stamp was dated 14 months ago. The folded paper was not a letter, it was a list. 12 names, all men, each with a small notation beside it. Initials, numbers, what looked like abbreviated medical codes. At the bottom of the list, in smaller print, a single sentence in my grandfather's handwriting. "When I am gone, take the coin to the Falk office on Lagoviger. Everything is already arranged." I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. My Uncle Marcus called that evening. He was my mother's half-brother, 10 years older, and he had a way of appearing whenever there might be something to gain. We had never been close. He opened the conversation the same way he opened all conversations, with the ending he already wanted. "So what did he leave?" he asked. "The house goes to your mother, I assume. What about the rest?" "There wasn't much," I told him. "The house, some savings, a few personal items." "What kind of savings?" he pressed. I told him I didn't have the details yet. "Well," he said, "whatever it is, it should be divided fairly. Your mother can't manage a property like that alone, and if there's any liquid," I said I'd be in touch, and ended the call. The ambassador's card had only 2 things on it: a name, Harold Fenn, and a phone number with an international prefix I had to look up: Iceland. I called the next morning. A man answered and asked me to hold. 30 seconds later, a woman came on the line. Her English was precise and unhurried. "We have been expecting someone," she said when I gave my grandfather's name. "Not expecting you, expecting someone." As if this call had been on a list somewhere, waiting to be checked off. She asked if I had the coin. I said yes. She gave me an address in Reykjavik and a time window of 30 days. She said it would be best to come sooner. I booked the flight that afternoon. I told my mother I was going to handle some paperwork related to the estate and that I might be traveling briefly. She didn't ask where. My mother trusted me the way she'd learned to trust my grandfather, without requiring explanation. I told my uncle nothing. The night before I left, I went through the rest of my grandfather's house methodically, not looking for treasure, looking for understanding. He had lived in that house for 31 years, and there was almost nothing in it that was decorative. Tools organized by size. Books organized by size. Books organized by subject. Kitchen shelves arranged with the efficiency of someone who had once needed to find things quickly in the dark. In the garage, on a high shelf behind a row of paint cans, I found a small fireproof lockbox. It required a 4-digit code I didn't have, so I took it with me. In a kitchen drawer, beneath the extra batteries and the spare house key, I found a folded receipt from a hardware store in Portland dated 6 years ago. On the back, in pencil, 7144. I tried it on the lockbox that night. It opened. Inside was a passbook from an Icelandic bank. The balance printed on the last statement took me a moment to process. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of tea before I read it again. It did not change. I flew into Reykjavik on a gray Tuesday morning. The city was smaller than I expected and quieter. Low buildings against a wide sky. The ocean visible from almost every angle. The air tasted clean in a way that felt slightly accusatory, like it was pointing out how long I'd been breathing the wrong kind. The address the woman had given me was on Reykjavík, the main commercial street. The building looked like a legal office from the outside, modest glass door, brass nameplate, no signage beyond the street number and the word Falk in small capital letters. Inside, everything moved at a pace that suggested time was respected rather than rushed. A receptionist led me to a private room. A man in his 60s arrived within minutes, introduced himself as the firm's senior advisor, and sat across from me with a folder already open. "Your grandfather first established a relationship with this office in 1987, he said. He spent it carefully, which I appreciated. My grandfather had not simply saved money, he had directed it. Every year consistently he had contributed a portion of whatever he earned. From the military pension, from a small machining business he'd run out of his garage, from investments he'd made patiently over decades, into a structured fund administered through this office. The fund had 2 designated purposes. The first was ongoing medical and financial support for a specific group of individuals, former Special Forces operators and their immediate families, men who had served in unconventional roles during the Vietnam era and whose needs had not been adequately addressed by the VA. The list of 12 names in the wooden box, I now understood, corresponded to the current active beneficiaries. The second purpose, written into the structure of the fund at its inception, was a succession provision in the event of my grandfather's death. Full oversight of the fund would transfer to the person named in a sealed document held by this office. That document had been sealed in 1994. The advisor opened an envelope and slid a single page across the table. My name was on it, my full name, Claire Ann Whitmore, written in my grandfather's hand 30 years ago, when I was 3 years old. "He chose you a long time ago," the advisor said. I didn't speak for a moment. The total value of the fund was just over $9 million. My grandfather had driven a 12-year-old pickup truck. He bought his boots at the same hardware store for 40 years because they carried one brand he trusted. He grew his own vegetables not as a hobby but because it was practical. He had never once suggested that money was something he thought about, and yet he had spent 3 decades quietly building something that would outlast him by generations. The advisor explained the operational structure, how disbursements were made, to whom, on what schedule, under what conditions. He told me that 2 of the beneficiaries had passed away in recent years and that their positions in the fund had been converted to support their surviving spouses. He told me that a man in rural Georgia had received funding for a specialized surgery the previous year that no other source had been willing to cover. He told me all of this with the calm efficiency of someone describing a well-maintained system, which is exactly what it was. My phone buzzed. Marcus. I let it ring. After the meeting, I walked along the waterfront for a long time. The harbor was quiet. A few fishing boats, seabirds moving against the wind without appearing to work at it. I thought about the coin in my pocket, worn smooth on one side from years of being held. My grandfather had touched it thousands of times. In what rooms, under what circumstances, I would never know. I thought about the 12 names on that list. Men he had served with, men whose injuries and struggles had continued long after the cameras in the history books lost interest. He had not complained about their situation publicly. He had not written letters to senators or organized campaigns. He had simply opened his wallet, consistently, for 30 years, and made sure the people he felt responsible for were not left behind. I called Marcus back from the hotel room that evening. I had decided on the drive back from the waterfront that I would not lie to him. I would not lie to him. I would not volunteer everything, but I would not lie. "What did you find?" he asked. His voice had the controlled lightness of someone who had been thinking about this call all day. "Grandfather had a fund," I said. "A private fund, set up decades ago." Silence. "For what?" "For veterans he served with. And their families." More silence. "Then, how much?" I told him. The silence after that was different. It had weight. "And you control it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm the name trustee, yes." "Since when?" "Since 1994, apparently." He exhaled slowly. "Claire, that money should be part of the estate. Whatever legal structure he put around it, a probate court would... Marcus. Consider that a deliberate attempt to... Marcus." My voice was steady. I surprised myself. He chose who he trusted with this. That decision was made a long time ago. He didn't consult anyone. It was his money. The line went quiet. "Then, I'll speak to an attorney." "I expected that," I said. After I hung up, I opened the wooden box again. I looked at the coin, the passport, the list of names. I thought about the fact that he had kept this from everyone. Not out of shame, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because he understood something that most people don't learn until it's too late. Telling people about your intentions changes the intentions. The moment money enters a conversation, it changes the shape of every relationship in the room. He had written it to me in a letter I found later, tucked inside the passbook. "I did not tell you because I needed you to be yourself first. The person I needed you to be could not be shaped by expectation." I read that line several times. The next morning, before I left for the airport, I met with the advisor once more to sign the succession documents and receive a full briefing on the current beneficiary cases. One of the men on the list, a former operator from North Carolina named Raymond, 74, with advancing Parkinson's, had been managing his medication costs out of pocket because a benefits appeal had stalled for 8 months. The fund could resolve that immediately. I authorized it before I left the building. It was the first decision I made as trustee. It took about 4 minutes. Marcus filed within 3 weeks. The language of his attorney's letter was clinical: improper exclusion from estate assets, potential undue influence, lack of transparency in foreign holdings, but the emotion underneath it was something older and less precise. He had never been close to my grandfather. My grandfather had never been warm to him, not out of cruelty but out of accurate perception. Marcus was the kind of man who calculated the value of relationships before committing to them, and my grandfather had spent a lifetime among men who could read that quality immediately and simply moved on. My attorney, a woman in Portland who specialized in international estate matters and had the energy of someone who had seen every version of this argument before, reviewed the trust documentation and was direct. "This is airtight." He worked with a reputable firm over 3 decades. "The paper trail is immaculate. Your uncle has no standing." "He'll push anyway," I said. "They always do," she said. "It's not about winning. It's about making you tired enough to settle." I was not tired. I was something closer to clarified. The hearing was held in a county courthouse that smelled like old carpet and humidity. Marcus sat across from me at the opposing table. He looked like a man who had convinced himself he was being reasonable, which is the most dangerous thing a person can look like in a courtroom. His attorney argued that the trust represented a diversion of assets that should have been subject to normal estate proceedings. My attorney responded that a private trust established decades before the decedent's death, maintained consistently, and legally registered in a jurisdiction with recognized bilateral agreements was not subject to those proceedings. She was not dramatic about it. She did not need to be. Ambassador Fenn appeared as a witness. He had agreed to it without hesitation when I reached him by phone. He testified that he had been personally aware of my grandfather's intentions regarding the fund since the early 1990s, that he had in fact encouraged its establishment after witnessing the treatment of several veterans they had both known. He said my grandfather had been the most deliberate person he had ever worked with. He said this without embellishment. Marcus's attorney tried to suggest that the ambassador's involvement represented an outside influence on my grandfather's decision-making. Ambassador Fenn looked at the attorney for a moment before responding. Walter Whitmore, he said, did not take suggestions. He issued them. The judge dismissed the petition. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and I stood near the parking lot for a moment without speaking. He looked diminished in the afternoon light. Not defeated exactly, but recalibrated. You knew he loved you more, he said finally. That's not what this was about. Feels like it. I thought about what to say. He trusted me with a responsibility, I said. That's not the same as being loved more. It means he thought I could carry something heavy without dropping it. Marcus looked away. And I couldn't. I didn't answer that. He already knew the answer and I was not there to confirm it cruelly. 3 months after the ruling, I drove to Marcus's apartment on a Saturday morning. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He stepped back and let me in. The place was clean in the way that suggests recent effort. I had done what my grandfather would have done. I had researched the situation before arriving. I knew Marcus had 2 outstanding debts that had been accumulating interest for years. I knew he was 2 months behind on his rent. I knew that without intervention, he was likely 18 months from a serious financial crisis. I sat at his kitchen table and placed a folder in front of him. The trust has a provision for family stabilization, I said. Structured, conditional, documented. He looked at the folder without touching it. Conditions, he repeated. Financial counseling, a managed repayment schedule, quarterly check-ins, capped annual disbursement tied to progress benchmarks. He was quiet for a moment. You want to supervise me. I want to protect what he built. Those are different things. He didn't trust me either, he said. He didn't know you well enough, I said. That's not the same. He picked up the folder. We spent 2 hours going through it. It wasn't comfortable. There were moments when the room felt tight and I could see him deciding between resentment and necessity, oscillating between them the way people do when pride and reality are pulling in opposite directions. But he stayed at the table. He read every page. He asked questions that were specific rather than emotional, which told me something. Before I left, he stood at the door and said, "He really set this up in 1994? Yes. You were 3. Yes." He shook his head slowly. He knew you'd be this person. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which I think was the right choice. Almost a year later, I returned to Maine. I drove to the cemetery on a morning in early October when the leaves had just begun to turn and the air had that particular New England sharpness that makes everything feel like a decision. I stood at my grandfather's headstone for a while. Simple granite. Name, rank, dates. He would not have wanted more than that. I had been trustee for nearly 12 months. Raymond in North Carolina was managing his medication. A widow in Oregon had received support for her daughter's first year of college. A man in Maryland, a former teammate of my grandfather's whose identity I knew only through initials and a case number, had received funding for long-term residential care after a series of strokes. None of them knew where the money came from. That was by design. My grandfather had understood something that most people discover too late, if they discover it at all, that the purest form of generosity is the kind that requires nothing in return. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not even awareness. He had given for 30 years without a single person outside this arrangement knowing he was doing it, and he had found that sufficient. More than sufficient. He had found it clarifying. Marcus had completed his first quarter of financial counseling. He had reduced his debt by roughly 20%. He had not called me once to complain, which I took as a sign of something. I pulled the coin from my jacket pocket. I held it in my palm for a moment, the weight of it familiar now in a way it hadn't been a year ago. The compass rose on one face, no markings. The coordinates on the other. I had looked up those coordinates early on. They corresponded to a point in the central highlands of Vietnam, near the Cambodian border. I had not tried to find out what happened there. Some coordinates are not meant to be researched. They are meant to be carried. I put the coin back in my pocket. He had lived 81 years without making a single unnecessary sound. He had built something that would continue operating long after every person who remembered his face was gone. He had chosen me to continue it not because I was the most obvious choice, not because I was the most qualified on paper, but because he had watched me, quietly over the course of a lifetime, and concluded that I was capable of doing something difficult without needing to be celebrated for it. I did not feel chosen. I felt assigned, which is closer to what he would have wanted me to feel. On the drive back down the coast, I thought about the kind of life that leaves no medals on the wall and no stories at the dinner table and no dramatic announcement of its own importance. And yet, when finally examined, turns out to have been more carefully constructed than almost anything built with noise. My grandfather was a Green Beret. 3 tours. Decades of silence. 1 coin, worn smooth from 30 years of being held in the dark. He did not leave me money to spend. He left me a practice to continue. And somewhere in rural Georgia and coastal Oregon and a residential facility in Maryland, people who had never heard my name were living slightly better lives because a quiet man in Maine had decided, a long time ago, that the measure of what you've done should never depend on who knows you did it. If there is someone in your life who has lived steadily and without announcement, who has built things in private that you are only beginning to understand, pay attention. Ask the questions while you still can, not because they'll answer, they probably won't, but because the act of asking tells them something important, that you are ready to carry what they've been carrying alone. And if you believe that the most meaningful things are often the most quiet, I hope you'll stay with this channel. Leave a comment below and tell me about someone in your life who led without ever needing to be followed, because that kind of person deserves to be remembered, even if they would have refused to ask for it.